Hi, so I'm in Bellevue, Washington. I made it to Chism Beach Park, and I just got here. It's not a bad walk. There's a cabin right behind me, which was apparently one of the original pioneer structures within the state of Washington. Burroughs Cabin, I think it's called. Anyway, let's go check out this place and then talk about... I always like going off the beaten... Well, this is paved, so it's not really off the beaten path, right? It's completely paved. But most people will probably go to a separate entrance, which is right behind me, which is clearly marked. And I'm just going to go right down this way and show you the lake. And again, when you think about beaches, you think about sand, and there is no sand here. It's a lake. I don't know why they call it Chism Beach Park. Seattle, especially, has a lot of nice lakes. Especially over in Puget Sound, especially at sunset. Oh, I think you can see, so let's see how much I can show you. Got some ducks behind me. Oh, and there's a couple of people out here just relaxing. And maybe try to get this angle, give you a panoramic view. And, well, you can't see from here, but that side is... Do you know if that's Bellevue or Seattle downtown? All those buildings?
Seattle.
That's Seattle? Cool, thank you. So you see some skyscrapers, and that's Seattle over there. So as long as we're here, let's just talk about, very quickly we talked about how the visual medium has made politics favor extremist statements. In other words, if you're competing for attention, the one who says, in some cases, the one who makes the most outlandish promises, in some cases, is able to succeed over someone else or a competitor that is more reasonable. And that is partly the consequence of a visual medium, whether it's television or YouTube or online media. And one of the things we're going to talk about is just the loss of the link between liberalism, progressivism, being a progressive, and being humble. Because when we talk about rhetoric, here's a better view, I think, of downtown Seattle. See those skyscrapers over there? Not much down that way, so I'm going to go the other way. And when we talk about these things overall, what we want to talk about is why, ultimately, within this kind of a framework, politically, why the liberals should, or the progressives, should be more careful rather than less careful. And one of the reasons is because liberalism is necessarily a long-term game. If you want to talk about immigration, for example, it's much easier to capture the public eye and the public ear by alleging that crime is up because of illegal immigration. Especially in an environment where it takes at least one generation for most immigrants to succeed. Even, remember that immigrants are almost by nature you can't even call them second-class citizens because they're not citizens, right? Their children become citizens in some cases, not in all cases, especially outside the United States. And so when you have a position or a situation, I'm passing some ducks here. Let's see if you can see them. Can you see them? Oh, there we go. There's one of them. So when we consider what we're competing against, the idea is that someone who's claiming that is trying to look for a scapegoat is always going to beat you if you don't try to put things in context. And you don't continue to tell the public that progress is a long-term game and a long-term objective. And if you have, say, a 4-year political system where your leaders switch out every 4 years on the civil side, you not only run the risk of having the danger of a de facto military takeover, not overtly, obviously, but just, in funding, which is at this point unchecked in the U.S. You also run the risk of simply losing overall. And that's what's happened in this country, which explains a lot of what's happened post-2001, where a lot of that spending shifted into the military. And if you look at, I'm here on the, I guess it's not called a pier, right? It's called a dock. Nice. Yeah, you can get some of that seawater smell. So back to the point I was making. Let's see if I can go down that way. I should be able to. So the whole idea is that if progress is a long-term game, a long-term objective, you also have to admit that you're always at a disadvantage against a conservative who can always win based on either a security argument or a fear-based argument. Because in the short term, you can always win by appealing to people's lesser natures and the lowest common denominator in the short term. And what's so odd about this aspect of human nature is this idea that the short term can so easily win over or people, when in fact humanity is supposed to be a long-term game, right? And that actually actually makes more sense when you realize that, as George Carlin once pointed out, that humanity is essentially an infection on the earth. Just because we've managed to dominate a few other species doesn't mean that we were really ever intended to be here. And George Carlin talks about the fact that, when we're gone, the earth will still be here. And so he calls us essentially a virus on the earth. And what is interesting, right, is that it does actually make sense once you put it in context, in terms of how long the earth has been here versus how long humanity has been here. And so it does actually make a little bit of sense that humanity would be geared towards the short term within an environment where it was essentially competing against animals. And so when you put it within that context, number one, you realize right away that if you accept the fact that we're a foreign species to this planet and may not have ever really intended to exist, but for luck and mutations and so on and so forth, it causes you, I think, to have a different perspective. And it also causes you to understand that if you're really interested in the long term, you're always at a disadvantage as a human being, regardless of creed, race, color, and so on. And once you realize that, you also realize why a progressive outlook is actually necessary. And yet, despite the fact that it's always going to lose to a conservative outlook, which is geared more to our instincts, our survival instincts, which explains exactly why fear-based marketing, whether political or otherwise, works. It explains why the 2016 election, which was essentially a verdict on the federal government's failure to address the public's desire for more illegal immigration enforcement, that was a verdict on that one issue, as well as many other issues, but particularly that one issue. And so the liberals essentially failed to address that issue, in part because they failed to understand and therefore market the story that would make sense, that would help us understand why we should believe them. And if you're not in a position where you're starting out by arguing the other side is appealing to our baser instincts, and then having a plan to compete with them, the progressives will always lose. And that's what's happened all over the world. Whether in Hungary, Poland, it doesn't matter where you go. People with money and property want to hold on to that money and property. They really do believe they've earned it. And in many cases they have. But you also have a position where, the idea, and one of the reasons liberals are criticized is precisely because they tend to harp on this idea that people who are self-made are, if not rare, if not exceptional, for the most part, a product of historical circumstance. And in making that argument, they're trying to do what I'm saying right now in a misguided way. They're trying to say, let me see if I can, this is the path that I should have taken, or that most people take, which is a paved path to come down on this side. So it doesn't, actually that might be it. Let me see if I can go down this way. So the idea really is that the liberals are trying to shove humility down our throats by arguing that there isn't really a self-made person in the country, which is clearly false. Not only does it remove human agency, there's a famous quote, either, I don't know if it's true or not, but that was attributed to a liberal politician out of Massachusetts that said that you didn't build that. You were able to build it, and it was meant you didn't build that by yourself. You built that within a context of, structures and political structures and legal structures that allows you to make those investments, which are, of course, underpinned by insurance and societal goodwill and cooperation and so on. But again, because you're dealing with a political situation, a political rhetoric, especially within a social media context where statements can be taken out of context very easily, the liberals have essentially not only lost this idea of humility, but also this idea that they have to be more careful in an era where the statements can be taken out of context. And that requires, I think, just a simple reputation. You have to be in a position where you understand you're at a disadvantage constantly. And that should make you more responsive rather than less. That should make you more able to try to propagate an argument that because you're always on the losing side, always, in other words, assuming that humanity is destined to survive another 10,000 or 20,000 or even 100,000 years or more, you're still going to lose. You're still always at risk of losing because of this idea that we're biologically geared towards the short term and our baser instincts can so easily be manipulated because it's all a visual spectrum. It's all based on the visual, which overwhelms, in many cases, common sense, which a lot of political structures have understood and therefore used to maintain power. People call that divide and conquer. It's more complex than that, and yet simple. If you are not able to create a story that appeals to our better natures, if you're not able to do that, you will always lose. Always. And the only way to maintain control of the narrative is to acknowledge indirectly and yet firmly that the other side is absolutely right in everything they say. And yet, if we believe them, we also have to ignore history. Because historically, what has happened when we accept the other side's appeal to a scapegoat, what was happened has been a slippery slope. And we, the progressives, I'm stepping into the shoes of a potential political candidate, we, the progressives, are on the side that says that we may be at a disadvantage, but we've never stopped trying. And once we accept the premise of the other side, that this particular minority group is the cause or a primary cause or a substantial cause of all these other problems that we're having. Once we accept that as the premise, we've already lost. We've lost a long-term game. And because human nature, right? Once you understand human nature, when you get to that point where the minority is being blamed for macro issues, what's really happened is a confluence of complex factors that have come together to repeat history. Whether it's in Germany, the United States, today, we're a deeply divided country, or in Hungary, or a lot of other places. Once you get to that point, what it means is multiple levels of checks and balances have failed. Which makes sense, right? 9/11, what happened? Checks and balances failed. The executive branch gained a lot of power, which of course means the military gained a lot more power. Then you had debt spiraling out of control, which again led to the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which then led to, at this point, more private and public debt worldwide than ever before, which also makes sense when you think about the economy being globalized for a long time. You put all that together, you actually have a platform that you can sell that allows you to compete with the conservatives. That's not what the liberal movement is doing in this country. They're doing something where they're trying to talk about diversity in isolation. They're saying that, they're allowing the other side to cherry pick issues out of context, rather than talk about an issue where, within context, where you've got failures on the banking system, private system, failures in regulation overall. And the reason we know that's the case is because by the time you get to the point where you're pointing to a minority as the cause of your problems, it means that you've given up trying to fix the macro issues. And if the liberals and the progressives are trying to take back the story, the narrative, they're going to have to understand economics, because that's one of the biggest failures they have, right? The Republicans in this country, the conservative side, have always been able to win simply by arguing that the liberals, the progressives, are quote-unquote tax and spend. And they've been doing that by, at the same time, taking out as much debt as possible to sustain a system of essentially military expansion and what George Bush, the first one, called trickle-down spending. So you've got a situation where essentially both sides have been using debt in order to paper over, literally, problems in this country. And neither side is willing to fix the problem. And as a result of this unsustainable economic paradigm. And as a result, both sides have lost the narrative and are now signaling virtue, while at the same time attempting to paint the other side as a malevolent actor, when in fact it's both parties that are responsible for essentially moving from a tax-based economic system where the government is responsive to taxpayers because it is funded by taxes, into an environment where essentially the government is run by bankers because it is now not running on taxes but running on debt within a globalized economic system. So once you understand that, the question, I guess, is how to market it, because it makes sense, I think, when you put it in context. And the question is, a separate question is, what do you do when you've got trillions of dollars that are backing up the paradigm, which means that it's much easier to blame a minority or an individual or some sort of philosophical movement or even an ideology, rather than your own banking system, your own lack of political will, your own lack of political compromise, and quite frankly, your own lack of economic understanding on both sides. That's the challenge that you want to meet. And the only way to meet it from the progressive angle is to admit that you failed. Because if you've been successful, we wouldn't be in this position that we're in today. And that's something that, and I hesitate to sort of, argue that the progressives are going to be the ones who understand economics, because even the communist movement, within the East, was really an anti-war movement. It wasn't really an equality movement, gender equality movement. It was never really spearheaded by economics. It was more, its economic philosophy was really against concentration of power. And unfortunately, the history of humanity has been concentration of economic power, and then a trickle-down system from that. Even Bitcoin, which is supposed to be decentralized, the overwhelming, I think it's 90% of the accounts are controlled by the top, only about 2.4% of 90% of the Bitcoin is essentially controlled by about 2.4% of the accounts. From what I read, there was an excerpt from a Bank of America study. So you have these competing principles that should give you enough work so that you never have to devolve to the point where you're pointing to a minority as the cause of your problems, or illegal immigration. But at the same time, you have to understand that you can do more than one thing at once. And so if there is a problem in your society where the other side is arguing illegal immigration is a primary cause of a lot of our issues here, including crime, if that's the argument they're making, then you have to make an effort to create a consistent strategy to deal with it. And, obviously a wall is not going to work. It's just one of those things, right? That rhetoric, right? What does it mean? It's rhetoric. It's appealing emotionally. But given the length of the border that would need to be built and patrolled, it's not feasible. And yet, even though people understand that, they still voted for the wall, for the president, a candidate that essentially promised to build a wall. And they didn't do it because I think they wanted the wall. They did it because they wanted something done. And why do they want something done? Why is it that we have such poor choices politically? You only have this sort of situation if you both fail. In other words, if the conservatives are becoming, are able to appeal to on the basis of such weak arguments, it means that they're responding to an even weaker argument on the other side. And so when you look back on the United States, it's just a tragedy at this point, because in order for us to be at this point, our educational systems have to have failed, our political systems have to have failed, and that, of course, explains a lot of the reasons why we've lost, essentially, political common sense.